Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Therapeutic Madness. I am your host, Mindy Vincent, and today I have my special co-host, Trip Mitchell, with me.
Well, I thank you very much. And technology-wise, we are jumping so far.
That's correct.
This is pretty cool.
This is super cool because, well, things are really cool today for a few reasons. And the most important one is because our guest today is Zach Rhodes. Zach is co-author.
You're kidding. We have Zach Rhodes today?
No, I'm so excited. And there's so much for us to talk about.
Did you just scream in Chris's ear?
Yes, I did. I'm sorry, Chris. I get excited. I scream. Everybody knows that about me. I'm really excited that Zach is here today. Now my sound just went away. I hope I'll be able to hear Zach.
Zach, can you? Oh, so, we can.
There
this
he is.
Great.
So Zach is the co-author of the book Outgrowing Addiction that he wrote with Dr. Stanton Peele. And then I have a biography that I'm going to read you about Zach, or maybe we'll just jump in and have Zach introduce himself.
Well, you just put your code into your phone and I saw it.
Good.
69, 69, 69.
First of all,
it was only 2 69s.
Okay.
Zach.
I felt so uncomfortable at first because I couldn't get my computer working and I was frustrated. I was like, all right, well, I'm going to be nice and peevish and resentful for this interview. And you guys inserted a little humor. It sounds like you're familiar with the Burlington area or know enough to pretend you are at least. I don't know.
Just a little bit, yep.
I'm from Burlington, Vermont. I'm a counselor for families and kids here in Burlington. I sort of stepped into the addiction field by contacting Stanton Peele. Did a podcast it was supposed to be a podcast about families, child development, and just, showing a little bit of expertise there and giving tactical advice. And I wound up just reaching out to people who I figured there's no way they'll ever answer and no way they'll ever come on the show, but why not? And everyone said yes. It was almost like I didn't want all these people to say yes. So I had a bunch of different experts, best-selling authors on the show. A notable one is Michael Shermer from Skeptic Magazine came on. He was my first guest. Then I had Carol Tavris, who wrote the book Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. And then
which is a great title.
That is a great title.
It's one of those that you wish you thought of it, isn't it?
Yeah, Trump just borrowed it.
He did. He's been borrowing it in perpetuity.
That's correct.
But, yeah, so I had all these cool people on, and I had read Stanton Peele's work for a long time. He and I became engaged for a number of reasons. We agree in a lot of ways that he didn't know it yet because he didn't know me, but that I think people think he's fringe in the field for, or at least they disparage him for. So I reached out to him. We had a great conversation. Stanton continued to engage me deeply about addiction and the things that I believed and he believed. And we realized that we were so compatible. He offered, "Would you like to write a book with me? This is awesome." I thought, oh my God.
You're like, what?
We really did it. Yeah. So that's the book that you have in front of you, Outgrowing Addiction, is what we came up with together. It took us a couple years to think about how we wanted to couch it, but it's a book about addiction and child development and behavior problems that kids have when they're growing up and in schools, and why those two things are so similar, if not exactly the same. Maybe we can get talking about that a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe just one thing to throw in is that I, in my 20s, I'm in my 30s now, and Vermont's a small place, so I try to keep the timeline a little bit fuzzy.
Have you
met
met Bernie?
In my 20s, I developed and then overcame a heroin addiction, which I thought for a long time made me an anomaly. The fact that I sort of outgrew it, overcame it, seemingly on my own, at least without any professional help. Mm-hmm. But it turns out, after looking at the data, nowhere near an anomaly. It's the rule, not the norm, not the exception.
That is correct. Do you know the statistic of how many people spontaneously recover? That's what it's called. When people, there's research that they call it spontaneous recovery, when people just kind of grow out of their addiction. I've heard it called
What is that number?
In the last thing that I looked at, it was 75 to 80% of people just spontaneously recover. When we talk about how many people are in need of treatment in this country and then how many people get it, don't you wonder what happens to the other 95% of people? The people who don't get forced into treatment and stuff. So, Zach, tell us a little bit about outgrowing addiction. I call it the developmental model of addiction. Is that correct, or is that not a way to describe it?
No, that's what we called our model. Maybe it seems too easy, but yeah, we called it the developmental model of addiction. So
makes total sense to me.
Coinage. Yeah. Well, when we got talking, Stanton first pointed me toward NESARC data, National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, that the enormous government study that's been done since, or similar studies have been done since the late 80s. This particular study of 43,000 people around, which are it's a representative sample of adults in America, been done for drug users and people who are, at the time they said, are dependent on drugs of all kinds. And he showed me that depending on the drug, actually 80 to 99% of people overcame their problems to these drugs over time, depending on the drug. So your 75 to 80% stat is good, broadly speaking.
Well, excuse me, Zach, and I come at this from a perspective of being an alcoholic.
12-stepper alcoholic.
Okay.
12-stepper. I've only done 11 of them, but I'm working on that. But in alcohol,
he's about to go back out. His disease is doing push-ups, Zach, waiting to take him over that 12th step.
So in alcohol, the numbers are reversed from heroin addiction, it would appear, because the vast majority of people don't get cured long-term.
From alcoholism?
Yeah. And what you're saying is that isn't the case, or is it so dissimilar to drugs that you can't look at them in the same fashion?
Yeah, I'm saying the best research we have shows that isn't the case, that the vast majority of people don't outgrow their addiction. That might be complicated. We might be parsing words here, splitting words here, but there's an enormous number of people with problems with alcohol who have long-term problems with alcohol, and that serves a confirmation bias of sorts, and there are people all around us. But the statistics show at a population level that most people will overcome addictions to alcohol. That doesn't mean they'll stop drinking, if that adds anything. But it means that the problems that they have in their lives, the destruction that they seem to have in their lives or had before, they outgrow those things. They mature. They start to live their values. They start to take on responsibilities. They gain skills. They live a more balanced life. And when they're surveyed again 4 years later, would say, yeah, no, I wouldn't say I have a dependency or an addiction or a use disorder anymore.
Wow. And so in essence, what's happened is they've matured. They've had different life experiences, maybe gotten married, something like that. And rather than going into recovery, or I should say into treatment, and go into a 12-step program, they equate other things that are happening in their lives with how they've overcome an addiction to alcohol.
Yeah, these are people who have overcome addictions and not sought professional help of any kind.
That is very counterintuitive to AA, which is a 12-step program that I'm in, where essentially you're taught that you are an addict for life and that you can't beat it.
You cannot, even though the Big Book itself says that we do recover, and the Big Book itself actually also says that they consider 2 years of clean time to be, or of sober time to be, a substantial amount of time. Yet you hear people in AA saying, you're a newcomer till you got 5 years, blah, 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 but it's in complete contradiction to what the Big Book actually says. I just want to share a little bit of my experience, because the reason why I'm such a huge fan of Zach and of Dr. Stanton Peele is because several years ago, I was at the DPA conference, the Drug Policy Alliance conference, the international one, and it was actually in Virginia. And around this time, I was probably 5 or 6 years sober. And I got sober I went into drug courts. I went to treatment. I got really involved in AA and Cocaine Anonymous. And
was there anything you weren't involved in?
No.
Okay, good.
Except for shenanigans. I stopped engaging in shenanigans for a period of time. So
you're a good case study then.
I am a good case study. So at around 5 years sober, I knew that my brain had healed, that my brain had developed, because I started using drugs when I was 12 or 13 years old, right? And so, but it was really weird. I had developed, over that 5 years, I developed reasoning and judgment. My frontal lobe had developed, and I could see it for myself, and as a practitioner, I know what that means, and I was like, wow, I have the ability to be fearful and to think things through and to connect consequence and behavior, and those were things I truly did not have before. I really didn't. And it was not from just working the steps that happened for me, and I knew also at that point that I could return to normalcy. But I was a member of a 12-step program, and in 12 steps, they tell you, if you're thinking that you can return to normalcy, that's your disease, doing push-ups, and then people say, well, you don't want to go back to where you came from, do you? And it's like, of course I fucking don't. I was shooting meth in my neck. Are you out of your fucking mind? But those fears are implanted in us that then make us like, it makes you doubt yourself. It makes you think that, I am going to be an addict for the rest of my life. But eventually the pain of staying stuck somewhere I did not belong was more than the fear of not staying there. You know what I mean? And so I returned to normalcy after 9 years of abstinence. Today, I'm still totally normal. I'm coming up on, in April, it will be 13 years that my life has been different, and I have found that it is absolutely true for me that I outgrew addiction. And I truly believe that you can treat addiction entirely and people can be healed entirely and cured of addiction, if we want to use the word cured, if you heal the traumas of the past, teach new coping skills, reduce risk factors, raise protective factors. I truly believe that those 4 things will treat addiction.
So Zach, your feelings, along certainly with the lovely Mindy, are so counterintuitive to everything that's taught in most 12-step programs. Have you gotten a lot of pushback? I imagine you have.
Zach, have you gotten pushback on this?
That was a dumb question, but I'll part of the 12-step program is admitting it and pressing forward. How much
One of the reasons
pushback do you get?
Well, that's a good question. Stanton really enjoyed that he worked on this project with me because I've absorbed some of his hate mail.
I believe it. People hold tight to the disease concept. They're like, don't you talk about our disease concept.
The nice thing about email is you can add the hate with just another line. Copy effed up email instead of CC.
Why are you bleeping out the F word on this show?
Right. Which is funny because I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to swear and I might slip. So that's so great.
You can swear all you want.
I do get a lot of pushback, which is really odd. My podcast, the Social Exchange podcast, is a show about parsimony, basically. Trying to have discussions that are difficult, especially discussions with people who have entered into a belief system for one reason or another, and talk about the differences in a comfortable enough way that we don't have to feel like we don't have to have dissonance so strong that we can't have a conversation and learn from each other. So I don't actually disparage 12-step groups. So what I'm not saying, and what people I often get accused of saying, is that, well, a lot of people outgrow addiction, so that means just do nothing. If no one people think I'm saying no one needs help, and we should just do nothing. It's just a completely laissez-faire. But I'm not saying that, and I don't believe that. A minority of an enormous number is still an enormous number, and that's about how many people seem to have long-term or problems with drugs and alcohol and other things that don't seem to go away. I just wanted to reverse the question. Instead of saying, well, let's see, 10 to 20% of people or something like that have horrible problems and long-lasting enough and terrible enough problems that you might even think of it like a disease, and extrapolating from that small number, we just asked another question. We turned that on its head and said, well, what about this enormous number of people who tend to ameliorate their problems seemingly on their own? What's going on with that? There must be more to that story. How are they getting better? And how can you apply that knowledge to the people who don't seem to get ahead in life? What I've learned from one of my colleagues, somebody who I call my intellectual arch nemesis, his name's Dr. Rick Barnett, and I don't know if you've heard of him, but
I have.
You have? Mm-hmm. So he's a 12-step guy just like you, and when I met him, we weren't compatible at all. We couldn't even have a conversation, and I've talked to him so much. I enjoy and I appreciate and respect the way that he comes to logical conclusions about things so much that he was able to engage me deeply about tenets of 12 steps and why they work for him and why they work for so many people. And it made me think. It made me think twice about 12-step programs didn't work for me, but who cares?
But statistically, Zach, they don't work for the majority of people. Mm-hmm. That's the challenge with 12-step programs.
Yeah.
Because people funnel through.
Truth.
But that was because they didn't want it bad enough, or they didn't they weren't thoroughly working the steps.
That's the rub, I think. It's like that at a
something wrong with you.
Level, we don't want our answers to society's problems to be something that's entrenched in any kind of mythology. It's if you develop a story about something that's good enough that it allows people some social access and some self-help skills and things like that like AA does. How could you say to people who it's working for, well, don't go to AA. It's bad. It's stupid. Don't do it.
Right. And why would you want to if it's working for them,
Right. And that's different than saying 12-step groups are what we need to be applying more and more often and throwing the same set of solutions at the growing problems in our society. So I guess that's where I don't know if you asked me any of those things, but I felt like I should get ahead of that.
Well, so this leads, though, I'm glad that you said that, because it leads to a question that I have is, so what do you view as a way to deal with and treat addiction? Because I know yeah. Tell us about what you do, Zach.
It's a really good question, and it's why...
Was it any better than my question so far?
Of course it was. It was asked by me.
Okay.
Better. I don't remember I got so far off track from what your question was that I don't remember what it was.
Welcome to Time with Me and Trip. Like this, it's nothing new for us.
I work with kids, and I have, for one reason or another, probably because of my being labeled as I was growing up, and probably being really misunderstood as a kid into high school, and someone who's made dumb choices on my own. And people thought they had me figured out. I'm sort of allergic to diagnostic labels on kids. The funny thing about that is that nobody pushes back on me for if I'm working with their child, or if it's a team of teachers or counselors, administrators, and they have students that they can see there's a problem and it's a behavioral or, this person's acting in a really challenging way. And I'm working with them non-diagnostically, and I help them ameliorate their problems, or I help them, give them the agency and the motivation and the skills to sort out the problems on their own. No one pushes back. No one says, hey man, you should have labeled him. So that's my inroad to the addiction field. When I'm working with kids, it's so obvious to me now. Motivation and ability is basically what people need in order to beat problems in their lives. When people are acting in a challenging way, they do it because the demands placed on them are more difficult to meet than their skill set allows for, or their skill set plus plus motivation allows for.
I'll be confiscating that out of the podcast, putting it in print on a meme, and it will be going on our UHRC Facebook page. Don't worry, I'll cite you.
All right.
Like, dead serious. That's one of the best things I've ever heard.
Oh, thank you. But and it's.
Could you repeat it, please?
Now watch him not be able to remember exactly what he said. No.
No, it's good. I've said it enough times. It seems like the perfect soundbite. It's just enough. I said that the demands, and I won't even say just kids. The demands placed on challenging behavior happens when the demands placed on a person are too difficult for their, or more difficult to meet than their skill set allows for. So it's lagging skills.
Yes. I tell people substance abuse is a coping mechanism, and it's a really good one.
Yeah, nothing bad with that coping mechanism.
If people knew something better to do than to stick heroin in their arm when everything in their life is on the line, they would do it,
Yeah. You see, it's interesting, the behavior, not non-drug behavior.
Yeah.
That you see people succumb to. They'll do the same silly thing over and over again, and it might suck for them. And they might say that it's, this is horrible. I hate these consequences, but at least I know what they are. And I see a lot of people who have a lot of motivation to stop doing those things. A lot of kids who have the motivation to stop doing those things. They want to do well. They would do well if they felt like they could. But people really underestimate how far motivation takes you in the long term. You can be really, really motivated to start a diet tomorrow, and you really mean it. And in 3 days' time, you're no longer feeling motivated when it comes to the daily grind. So the way I'm not avoiding the question. The way that I work with people is just in the most practical, folk psychological sense. I really just help people one step at a time figure out what the hell they want, what's getting in the way, how to communicate what's getting in the way, and just opening up, lowering the bar a little bit to meet their skills, or helping people acknowledge what their skills are so that they can use them to overcome a problem. And I would say that it's so stupid, that's so practical, it's so obvious, But that's what I think there's no sidestepping the fact that that has to be the only way that we help people overcome their problems.
Well, if you could provide the motivation and the skill set for people to overcome problems, you'd be the richest guy on the planet.
Yeah, well, I shouldn't say I provide it, but I can help people access it and see it.
Yeah. I think, because I agree with that, because I think that people internally have a motivation I think people are doing the best that they can. And I think most people have an internal motivation to do more, but circumstances around them, their skill set, emotions, I think play a huge role in why people can't do what they want to do. And oftentimes, like I find through motivational interviewing and such, that, people just don't know how to articulate oftentimes what it is they want. And then they definitely don't know how to get there.
But if you take a drink or a drug and it makes you feel better, that has nothing to do with personality, has nothing to do with motivation. That is something that is very internal to all of us.
Yeah.
How do you turn that off?
It has everything to do with motivation, though. I mean, there was a motivation to do something or to seek some experience there. I mean, to
seek pleasure, avoid pain.
Sure.
That's a pretty good one right there.
Most people do seek pleasure or avoid pain, and that's how substance use starts, and it just gets reinforced in the brain.
So in that sense, that we don't make really a distinction, maybe a values choice because of the fact that illicit drugs are illegal, but not anything that's worth really talking about. We don't make a distinction between drugs and other kinds of addictions that people could have, an over-involvement and concentration in sex, pornography, gambling, video games, technology. It's addiction is an overall experience, the whole gestalt, and it has a time element to it that I think people don't recognize when they have this complete hyper focus on the drugs that people take.
So looking at it from the macro standpoint, you wouldn't focus on the drugs or something. You would look at the overall behavior, that someone might have an addictive personality, and work on kind of relieving the pressures on that individual. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know. I don't know what addictive personality means. I'm not really trying to give you a hard time. I just don't know. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, in essence, it seems like many people, if they have a challenge with alcohol, for instance, will have other challenges on their life, on things that are not very, they're all going to hurt their lives overall. So I find that a lot of people that I meet in addiction or in 12-step programs aren't just alcoholics. They might have an eating disorder. They might do drugs. They might be a total dickwad. There are a lot of things. There are very few people that I meet that have a perfect life, except for this one small thing: is they drink extraordinarily, at bad times. So how do you work with people like that?
Well, I think that the keynote that I'm picking up on is that you take the drug away, you take alcohol away. What does that do to the person's life? Are they immediately healed? And of course not. People have the entire experience of their lives that is making them who they are and believing the things they believe and seeking the things that they seek. Alternatively, to simply focusing on a drug, which drugs to do, which drugs not to do, we help people generate positive experiences in non-drug in ways that don't relate to their addiction. And that means, you were talking, Mindy, about motivational interviewing. Mm-hmm. You can call it whatever you want, but that really means a lot of, and you also mentioned that people have a hard time articulating what their problems are and what they want. So the first step for me is allowing people to sort of articulate what their problem is. Sometimes you just let people talk through what their problems are, and it's kind of the first time those thoughts that have been bubbling up have manifested into something coherent. So people at times will just figure out their problems on their own. We have a program called the Life Process Program.
I'm going to ask you about that. You might as well just get into it.
It's an online addiction program, and one of our biggest values is that, above all else, we just want to make sure that people feel like that they're articulating things on their own and not being told that they themselves are one thing or another, or they have some sort of personality or another. People will start these written exercises that we get them to fill out. They'll send them in, and then we'll get an email that says, "Hey, thanks for the first 2 out of 50 modules. I just realized what my problem is. Bye." So and so
you're putting yourself out of business
before we've done anything. Yeah, it's not that easy for some people, but you have to look to the life space of an individual. and not just the substance that they're seeking.
Yeah. Can you tell us more about how your program works? Like, what exactly do people do? How do people access it? Like, what have people found? What have some of your outcomes been, maybe?
Sure. It's you access it. It's a life process program. If you search that or go to lifeprocessprogram.com, and it's just an online program, and it's sort of a cognitive behavioral therapy kind of framework. And people fill out written exercises. There's this reading material and videos, and then they fill out these really basic who are you questions. What are your resources? What are your skills? What are your values? And they're answering these questions to themselves, and then a coach on the other end will respond to these questions, sort of like you were saying, motivational interviewing, summarizing, helping frame the things in a goal-oriented sort of way. If they want to, they can access a coach one-on-one, like a therapy session through Skype or Zoom. And so there's 8 different modules. So first we talk about who you are, what's your prologue. Then we talk about what are your values, and using those values as a compass for what goals might be. Then you say, what's your motivation to attain these things? What are your goals, and what are your skills? What skills are you lagging in? And what are your resources to overcome any sort of lagging and compensate for lagging skills? What's your social life like? What's your family like? What is your style of giving feedback or receiving feedback like? And along the way, things sort of present themselves as problems that need to be solved, as well as skills that people have that they didn't even really think they had before. It's like, oh, I really am. It's amazing sometimes. There was this guy that really recently who obviously loved to write, and he's really articulate. He wanted to do something creative. He's stuck in academia. He feels like he's at beating his head on the table because he's inside these walls and cramped up. And I just asked that, have you ever thought about doing freelance writing? And then he never thought about that before. It's just incredible. So sometimes skills surface that people didn't think they had, and motivation surfaces that people didn't know they have, and problems surface for the first time that they didn't realize they needed to overcome.
How long have you guys had this program around?
I think Stanton developed it in like 2008, 2009. I might be wrong about this. It was, and it's really we've really made it a solid program that's easy to navigate in the last 3 years.
That's really cool. I'm glad that we brought that up because I like people. I'm always trying to help people find alternatives for recovery and for life changes.
So you're saying going somewhere and spending $30,000 for 28 days is not the ideal way to recover?
Could be. It depends on how many massages you're getting. What do you think, Zach? Just kidding. It's $80,000 if you're getting massages.
You're not going to trick me into telling people what they should or shouldn't do, but I would imagine that the vast majority of people would rather spend $59 a month or whatever it is to really think and talk and learn about themselves in the comfort of their own home than spend $30,000 and go to a rehab.
Okay, and just for those who are math challenged, $59 is substantially less than $30,000.
I think that's right. I checked that this morning and it's still checked out.
I'm here for a reason.
So Zach, tell us, we're running short on time, so there's a couple more things I want to make sure we just touch on in this first episode of you here because you're coming again.
By the way, look at that camera.
At that one?
Yes. Yeah, as you talk.
That's hilarious. I'm looking at Zach because he's on a screen up here ahead of me. Normally I'd be looking at you all, but I'm looking at Zach because I'm talking to him. And I'll try to look at you too.
Natural.
Huh?
It actually seemed pretty natural to me.
Thank you.
So we're good. Everything's good.
No.
Okay.
I love Trip.
I showed some input there.
I'm just joking. I love Trip. So you have a podcast, The Social Exchange. Can you tell us a little bit more about your podcast? And I was also going to ask you about the Families for Sensible Drug Policy show that you host as well. And shout out to Carol Katz-Beyer from Families for Sensible Drug Policy. Love you, Carol.
Oh, cool.
I love her. She's one of my favorite people I've ever met.
She's the hardest working woman in show business, for sure. She's
I thought that was us.
The Social Exchange is a podcast. I'm a sort of an intellectual kind of person, not meaning I'm smart, but that I'm an ideas person. I enjoy talking through things and articulating things with people who are also verbal. And so I invited intellectuals on. A lot of them are best-selling authors and people who are, trending, so to speak, in academia. And so that's that podcast. We tend to talk about a lot about addiction now, but it's about all kinds of social problems. And I invite people on to have conversations that maybe are taboo on some. I'm a pretty liberal guy. I'm in progressive Burlington, Vermont, and I play the part pretty well. But I've had like Charles Murray on the show, or people who are deeply conservative and well-known conservative folks. So that's a show about social issues, psychology, and now a lot about addiction, because that's just what consumers of the podcast really wanted. Alternative to that is the Families for Sensible Drug Policy podcast, where I invite people on to tell their stories. A lot of them are addiction professionals themselves, like you, but who have a deeply profound story to tell me about their own experience, like you. So maybe we should just do this now, and you'd be a great guest for that show. I'm realizing as I speak it out that you're a shoo-in. So I do that on behalf of Families for Sensible Drug Policy, which is a nonprofit organization run by a miraculous woman who lost 2 of her children to drug-related deaths, and has begun this organization because she, as a parent, felt that there was nowhere to turn. As somebody who wanted to make sure she wanted some help setting boundaries for her kids, but also being compassionate with them. So she wanted to turn to professionals to help her out. She figured there's nowhere to turn. So she was mad at professionals at first, and then she realized it's really policy in general that limited her options. So she has made a career, literally, out of trying to get family voices together and to change policy in sensible, meaningful ways. So I'm really happy to be working with them and stepping back from just talking about ideas and talking about real life circumstances and people's stories.
And what is great, and I've been lucky, we do a podcast here called Odyssey House Journals, and that's how I met Mindy a number of months ago. But when you meet people who've lost a child and they can take that, the toughest thing that could ever happen to a parent, and use that as motivation to do something good, that is ultimately, it's very recharging to hear that. It's good to hear that. And so it sounds like the woman you work with has taken a really crappy situation and done something amazing.
Yeah, twice over. And Carol is a friend of mine as well, and she just has the most calming, loving, nurturing energy. Every time I'm around her, I just want to hug her and lean on her. She's such a wonderful human being. She's so compassionate. She's so open with her story of losing 2 out of 3 of her sons.
Wow.
And whenever I even share Carol's story or read her posts, I cry, because I just can't imagine going through that kind of loss. But she does turn it around and makes huge impacts in policy and across the country, and inspires and motivates people like Zach and I every day. She's wonderful. Families for Sensible Drug Policy is great.
Families for Sensible Drug Policy. I just wanted to say that if this is not why I do it, but it is a showing of good faith that this is not hypothetical for me when I try to talk about addiction and the statistics about how most people outgrow it. I'm deeply concerned and want people to understand that at least the framework for how to help people, and that it's really, as you said earlier, it's counterintuitive what I'm saying. But I see people like Carol and reach out to families that she works with, and these are people who are very, very resentful about things. I've talked to parents of kids now who are so angry, and when Carol was able to reach out to them and say, "Hey, I kind of know what you're going through. I understand that you feel like there's nowhere to turn. Just letting you know, it's not everything's lost." And you see these people who are just angry, wanting to buck the system and destroy everyone around them. I've met people who are almost nihilistic because they've lost kids, and it takes so little to change their mind and let them know that the things that they were thinking all along are not so crazy, and that their children who have passed away or having the worst problems in their lives have hope, either have hope ahead of them, or that the things that they did with their children before they had passed away weren't insane after all. And it's a miraculous program.
I love that. And, that's one of my things about why I do the work that I do, is because our current paradigm around addiction, and by believing that if we turn the screws on people, if we punish them enough, that will change their behavior. We are causing such significant harm to people who are already, sometimes traumatized, but definitely at very least not doing the best they've done in life, right? And
Sure.
just the way that we tell families to treat their loved ones, the way that people who struggle with substance use internalize these narratives in society, and then we punish ourselves. I see that all the time, and I think that that's probably the harm that hurts my heart the most from the current paradigm of addiction, is just what it endorses for families, society, our policies to do to people who use substances.
Yeah. So I would like people just to know it's a farewell here that, as you're saying, the idea that someone either has to be punished or succumb to the fact that they're forever diseased and can't overcome it is something we need to get rid of. That's a thought we need to push out of our minds and open ourselves up a little bit to exploring the enormous gray area in between.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay, well, Zach, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be on our podcast today, and I can't wait to have you on it again because there's so much more I want to talk about. I want to have a podcast with Zach talking about drug courts and some of those policies and how they work, and I have to say I respect so much that you work with children because I love kids so much that I would just cry all the time if I worked with them. I can't even do an assessment for a child who's depressed. I'll just cry. So I love people who work with kids. And
I'm the sappiest. I actually do. From time to time, I do shed a tear.
I would cry all the time. I'm like, come here, little friend, or I'd kick the ass of their parent, who's not being nice enough to them or something. So, but thank you so much, Zach. It means so much to me personally that you were on the show, and I can't wait to have you again. And Trip, thank you for joining me as co-host today again, my friend.
Well, once again, my faith in what I've learned through a number of years in AA has been questioned. But you know what? It's great that people are doing thought. People are looking at it, that there's not one clear method to beat addiction and to enter into recovery. And Zach, thanks so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Mindy. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Zach. And thank you for watching us on Therapeutic Madness. Stay mad, my friends, and we'll see you next time.